Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the report. Today we're going to be talking about three important subjects, all of which pertain in some aspect to the presidential race. We're starting off by discussing our presidential ratings change today in Texas, as well as our Senate ratings change in Montana. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about the presidential debate tomorrow, and we'll conclude by talking about mail-in voting, its effectiveness, particularly some of the states where it has already ran into some difficulties. So we're going to start I guess I'll just throw it to Eric Cunningham real quick to talk about what went down with our ratings change in Texas, where we kind of followed the recent polling and decided to move the contest to leans Republican from toss-up, thinning out the toss-up category at the presidential level. So, Eric, why did you do this? What does it mean for the state of the presidential race? It's a pretty important state, 38 electoral votes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically, there's a lot of reasons why we made this change. We made this back in July initially, along with a lot of other states moving them towards the left, as it appeared really the Biden landslide territory, and specifically his polling in some of these states like Texas was really impressive at the time. The problem is obviously it's a toss-up state at the moment, but we're thinning out our toss-ups as we get closer to the election. And just looking at the recent polling trends, granted, some of them, there was a PPP poll that came out today that there is even. If you consider their Democratic pollster, you give it a couple point advantage. It's still within the margin of error. So part of this is a trend in public polling. Part of it is this: we're seeing Trump actually do a little bit better in some of these Sunbelt states than in places like Pennsylvania, even or Wisconsin, even Ohio. He's having issues with, but in places like Texas, the polling seems to have stabilized relatively all right. I mean, it's not a situation where you'd like to be in, being up around 2 to 3 points in a state like Texas, which has voted Republican for decades now, is obviously less than ideal. But it's better to be in a situation where you're probably going to win the state than probably not. We're not discounting the possibility of a Biden win here, especially if the debate goes terribly for Trump, if some scandal comes out, if the tax return stuff somehow goes big. And the polling gets worse, there's obviously a scenario where Biden could win the state, and that's why it's only at leans. But we also feel comfortable with the internal knowledge we know. We're a news organization. We have various sources, and they've been right on the money with what's been the trends that have been going on in Texas and the Sun Belt in particular. So we feel pretty confident with the public polling, with what we know from our own research, that this is the right move. Obviously, things could change later. If they do, we'll adjust. This is the only state we moved this cycle. We still have many other states in the toss-up column, including North Carolina, Ohio, and Georgia, and Florida, obviously, as big ones. So those will be ones we're going to be paying attention to more in the coming weeks, as we mentioned in the article.
And Texas has moved, and when I say slightly, I mean literally slightly, but it has moved slightly towards Trump again in terms of his advantage in the polls. I mean, you did have two credible polls come out from Siena and the New York Times, Siena College and the New York Times. The Upshot poll is fairly accurate in 2018, showed a Trump +3 race. I also like that they polled both major third-party nominees, showed them at around 2% of the vote. And then Quinnipiac University, which is a B-plus pollster, had a Trump +5 race. Now, you also had YouGov, Trump +2, and then obviously PPP with that even race there. But if I'll just share my screen real quick, maybe to just give any viewers, people watching this, kind of an idea of what we're talking about with Texas. If you don't already know about the 538 model, it's something I would highly recommend looking at. But as you can see here, really the first time since earlier this year, at least recently, within the last few days of September, Trump has managed to kind of gain a little bit and expand this divide between Biden and himself in Texas. So I think the polling here helped justify our leans Republican rating, and we're going to have to see if it keeps up or if it changes. But the point is, when we're looking at the race in Texas, it's still very close within the margin of error. Could go either way, but I do agree at this point, Texas still has enough Republican strength to be a lean R state in this current presidential environment, even in a very bad environment for the Republicans.
Yeah, and part of this is what drove our decision to move Montana as well. It's that at this point, when you have a state with a partisan lean like this, where it's expected to, for example, vote for John Cornyn, we have that race as likely Republican. At some point, for us to consider Biden a favorite here, or a real contender to win the state, he would need to be leading in some polls, or need to not be seeing those Trump +5, Trump +3, Trump +2 polls. Obviously, Trump's suburban problems are kind of a big deal, but it would also be a big deal for a state that voted for him by 9 percentage points last time to flip, especially a state like Texas, which is large, lots of metropolitan areas to advertise in. It's not an easy state to win in by any means. And it seems like the Biden campaign is focusing on places like Ohio, which is a more winnable option. It's a state that obviously was a little bit closer than Texas last time, actually, if you look at the...
And it's a state as well that's been tightening in recent weeks.
Yeah.
Actually, Biden in the 538 average
Mm-hmm.
polling aggregate there, he took the lead, albeit narrowly, for the first time in the campaign, essentially.
Yeah. So obviously that's something we looked at here. And if the polling lead in Ohio is similar in future weeks, we will consider moving Ohio to leans. Keep in mind, we're nearing the end of the campaign, the point where we can say, this race is a pure toss-up for a lot of these, kind of goes away. There are pure toss-up states like Florida, although Florida seems to be a little bit better for Biden than expected. North Carolina still seems like a pure toss-up. Georgia is trending a little bit more Republican, at least in the Senate races. And then even like Iowa is close, although the rumblings we've heard seem to suggest some sort of a Trump advantage there, but not enough given the public polling to suggest a move there. But I do think our decision to move the state is well founded, and it was always the shakiest of these toss-up states, right? I mean, if you're winning a state like Texas, you're having a massive national landslide, probably of around at least 8 to 10 percentage points.
Yeah.
And granted, there have been polls that have said that, but the likelihood of that is relatively slim still.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking right now at the general polls and where Biden should target, well, Texas has moved slightly away from Biden. A state like Ohio has begun to move a little bit towards Biden overall.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the beginning of September, Trump was still the favorite in the polling here. We'll just show real quick how it's gyrated, just for the viewers. But as of late, Biden has retaken a little bit of a lead there.
Ohio's been a surprise.
And it's important to remember that if Trump wants to be elected president for a second term, he pretty much, I would say he needs to win Ohio, because since 1960, there hasn't been a Republican who's been elected president without Ohio.
Yeah,
so
there's no map for him. Yeah, there's no map for him where he does not win Ohio, I would say. Yeah, that's a pretty firm cog in any Republican victory at this point.
I mean, yeah, and it's just kind of natural if you look at how the pieces fall into place, because Ohio is still redder than Pennsylvania at the presidential level, and states like Michigan and Wisconsin. But if you look at this, you can see it really did start to tighten here to the point where Biden just took a lead. I'm curious to see how the lead in Ohio either increases or decreases following the debate, but I think Ohio is a very critical state.
Yeah.
We'll have to look at. And
I mean, if you look at the trend there, I mean, it's pretty shocking. I mean, it's going from a state that Trump was probably favored in by a good margin a couple months ago, to a state that right now, if you had to do a coin flip based on the recent polling, Biden would have a very good chance here. We actually, well, this will probably be out sometime this week or in the coming days. We actually did the latest episode of the Map Room on Ohio, and that's there are areas where Biden could improve in, places like Columbus, like Cincinnati, like even Cleveland or Toledo, on top of a lot of Rust Belt areas that were really shaky places to begin with, places like Youngstown, Akron. There are areas where Biden could improve, even marginally, which would help drive down, because what drove Trump's 8-point victory there was this utter domination in these rural areas. And long term, it's hard to sustain these 60, 70, 80% wins in a lot of these counties that have more Democratic strength underneath than you would expect. Especially when they're not traditionally too affiliated with the Republican Party, at least to that degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I want to throw it to Jared right now, actually. Basically, Jared, what do you think about the way that the presidential battleground map's been changing? Because you've had states like Ohio and districts like Nebraska too kind of move toward the Biden campaign, whereas you've had polls in Florida and Texas showing Trump kind of tightening or gaining ground on Biden, at least in Florida. And in the case of Texas, Trump expanding his narrow lead to a close lead, but slightly larger. And what do you think this means for where the Biden campaign is going to look at in terms of forming its electoral coalition going forward to November?
Right. So I think this is a prominent example of things returning to the mean. And it's not the mean that we saw back in 2012, but in a sense, it's the fact that some of these ancestral Democrats who maybe decided to to take a bet and vote on Trump are sort of coming home to the party. Not a lot of them, not even enough to make up significant ground.
Mm-hmm.
But Trump truly did hit a ceiling in places like the Youngstown area and in some of these very traditionally Democratic areas in places like Ohio and even Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And his levels there, getting 45% in Tim Ryan's district. I'm not sure if that's even conceivable nowadays, even though the trend is looking favorable to him. And in Ohio, also, you're going to see that if Biden does manage to secure victory there, his coalition can be a lot different. And as we talked about in the Ohio episode of the Map Room, again, it's going to involve those suburban, very leftward trending counties, sort of Kasich land, as I call it, I believe, places like Delaware County, Ohio, which are highly educated, immediate suburbs of Columbus, as well as in Hamilton County with Cincinnati, even Butler County, which is a very deeply red exurban county. It's really about margins. It's about Biden paring down the Republican margins there, which have traditionally bolstered strength there. And that's going to help him at least make Ohio a very competitive state. Now, you're seeing also in Nebraska's 2nd district, I believe it was Dave Wasserman who mentioned it today, but this is not going to be a 50-50 coin flip toss-up as we've seen in recent history. Now, while Trump was able to win this district by 2% in 2016, Biden now has a demonstrable advantage in his district. And this is as the current incumbent in Congress, Don Bacon, is outrunning Trump by several points. And so there's a large contingency of Biden potentially winning this district, securing an electoral vote from Nebraska, all while the Republican in Congress is able to win this district once again. And this will be a rerun, essentially, of what happened in 2008. I believe the incumbent was Lee Terry, Republican, who was able to is that
Except
correct?
He outran by, even though Bacon's going to outrun Trump by quite a significant margin, Lee Terry outran McCain by even more.
Yeah. So party polarization is going to prevent huge disparity between there, but you are going to see some differences there. Now, to comment on places like Texas, because we're starting to see more consolidation around traditional coalitions, and I think that's going to be really exemplified and exacerbated by what's going to unfold with the Supreme Court, where you're going to see some more members of the traditional Republican fold coming home to the party just because of what they see, just because some of those core values that are not necessarily associated with Trump are what define their vote. It's not going to be to the extent that's going to necessarily put Texas out of reach for Democrats. Texas is very much still a competitive state. It can go either way. Even the Republicans do have a fundamental advantage there. It's not a state that's going to be won easily by either party. And we are seeing that as well down ballot with some House polls where Republicans are performing nearly the same as Cruz and perhaps a little bit worse. That all goes to indicate that Texas is going to be a close election, even as Republicans are, based on fundamentals, favored. But again, just so I don't ramble on too much, and so I can just encapsulate this all, you are seeing some of this traditional behavior start to reform itself. And this is typical as we get close to elections, really in any election year.
And this kind of leads into what I'd call the nightmare scenario for Republicans long term, which is that if this new base of support that Trump had, it doesn't ultimately stick around, but the losses in the suburbs do, that's where you have a problem. If those voters in Ohio leave, and then places like Columbus and Cincinnati keep getting bluer and bluer as they keep growing, that puts any gains in Ohio in jeopardy. If Texas, those rural areas that did turn out a little bit more for Trump, if they're just stuck there, or they go back a little bit, places like Midland, Odessa, even smaller cities continue to trend a little bit Democratic, going from like 75 to 80% Republican counties to 65 to 70, kind of like what you're seeing in counties like Forsyth and Georgia. This makes a lot of places competitive that really wouldn't have been, while not delivering those sizable gains that Trump saw with working class voters in 2016. There's many states where you could see this problem, even Michigan. Michigan, lots of voters voted for Trump, but also lots of voters who are Republicans in Oklahoma left, and they have left for good if the House races are any indication.
Yeah, but long term, those two factions can't be in the same political party because they'll end up causing the party to fissure into two pieces. So in 2020 and 2024, it may play a role, but I highly doubt the suburbs and the remaining rural ancestral Democrats are going to be in the same Democratic Party for much more than a few years if they haven't left already.
Yeah, and a note on Eric's comment is that harkening back to the 2018 senatorial race in Texas, what we saw there with the results is that in districts like the first, which is categorically ancestrally Democratic. Louis Gohmert, the current representative, is a Republican, but before there's a Democrat, I believe it was Max Sandlin, who represented the district. What you saw there was that Ted Cruz reverted back to Romney-level successes in districts like those. These are predominantly rural, non-college educated districts. However, the floor sank the floor sank for Republicans in those crucial suburban and even exurban areas of cities like Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. And so even if Trump does mildly outperform Romney in those rural areas, just because of what we're seeing in some of the more crucial urban/suburban areas, it's just not going to be enough to deliver a strong victory for him.
And that's the problem, because even if the strength in rural areas starts going up, if they can't keep the suburbs competitive, it's not enough votes to win a national election long.
And this is why Cornyn isn't especially at risk, right? His weakness is with rural voters, but his strength has always been with suburban and urban voters. And as we're seeing in the polls, they haven't abandoned him yet. He's polling better than Trump, and MJ Hager is doing considerably worse, even though she's very well funded at this point. I don't think that's a coincidence. John Cornyn does have residual strength of those longtime voters in places like Fort Worth, Texas, Collin and Dent counties, north of the Dallas, Fort Worth suburbs, areas around Houston. Even people down about like Dan Crenshaw, who's probably going to win his seat on the strength of those ancestral voters, even though the district is drawn a little bit weird. There's a reason he's not in a ton of risk of losing that seat, but Trump may be. If you look at, if these polls are any indication, long term at least. Obviously we're confident in moving this to leans, but there is risk for Republicans, especially if that bleed in these urban areas, which the Texas Triangle area in particular, this huge central urban conglomerate that stretches from Austin to Dallas to Houston. If that decline is what the problem is, that's where most of the people in the state live. So long term, that's not a sustainable coalition, even if it works this time.
Yeah, and I think for Cornyn specifically, just because, as you said, his support is harbored among those traditional Republican suburbanites, I think something that's quite feasible is that Trump and Biden run very closely in the state, whereas Cornyn is able to mimic those Trump 2016 margins, especially among voters who comfortably voted for McCain and Romney, held their noses and decided to begrudgingly vote for Trump, decided to vote Democrat in 2018, down ballot, and also for Biden, but are now coming home for someone like Cornyn, who is more palatable to people like them.
And you can see that with the way the Senate race is shaping up there. On average, Cornyn's leads are around 9 to 10 points, anywhere from 7 to 10 points in that race in polling, whereas Trump's lead is only about 2.
Yeah, and that 7 to 9 point lead is about where Trump would be. That's about where you would expect, with a couple points worse of a performance, rather than, if the polls are showing a 5 point lead for Biden, it would be utterly stunning for Republicans to go from a 9 point lead in Texas to like a 2 point lead. Whereas it would make more sense for someone like Cornyn to go from a 9 point win to a 7 point win. If you just compare to 2016, where Hillary won by around 2 to 3% the popular vote. Again, a lot of things are in flux here, and I really do want to see more polling out of Texas, although I think it's going to shift to places like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin long term, to the much chagrin of people on Twitter who want polls from Georgia, in particular. But I feel out of all the toss-ups, this was always the shakiest. There's a potential it could come back. But at the moment, given what we know on the inside, what we've researched, the polls, we feel comfortable making this shift. In the similar logic we used in our article for the Senate shift in Montana. At some point, the lean of the state does need to be accounted.
Bit about Montana, because that's another race where the 538 model gives Daines a 67% chance of winning. The average is about 51-49 Daines, but he's led in 2 polls recently by credible pollsters, Emerson College and then Siena College, New York Times Upshot polling. Both showed leads for Daines there against Bullock. So Bullock's lead has undoubtedly declined. Now, Bullock's still a strong candidate with strong crossover appeal as an incumbent governor, which is why the race is still going to be close. And, if Biden can keep Trump below double digits in Montana, it could theoretically be enough for Bullock to win. But the question really is, if the race has seemingly begun to drift again towards Daines, can you just explain why you decided to move it from toss-up to leans Republican?
Well, I didn't make this decision. Kraz and Adam, who made the Senate team, did, but I know the reason and I can explain it. So here's a couple reasons. One, There have been a lot of polls. There's been 10 polls. They're not all high quality, but you throw them into the average. The first 5 polls, really good for Bullock. He tied the first one and led the other 5. This was from University of Montana, Progress Campaign, Public Policy Polling. Pretty typical Democratic firms you would expect. This was up until mid-July. Towards the middle of July, Civic's Daily Cost showed a 2-point lead. We started seeing more polls where there's been 6 or 1-point leads. Siena Upshot had a 1-point lead. This is not the direction that Steve Bullock wants to be trending. His approval ratings have gone down if you look at polling, whereas they were generally comparable in terms of approval rating, him and Daines. So that's one factor. Another is that Daines doesn't really have any controversies. You need someone like Bullock to have just an exceptional approval rating, strong fundraising, strong polling. And while some of it's there to make it competitive, it's not there yet. One other factor, traditionally in Montana, Democrats have relied on third-party candidates to deliver Republicans' votes, libertarian candidates, Constitution Party, that sort of thing. This is a 2-man race. There is no other candidate on the ballot. It's your choice is Daines or Bullock. In the past, third-party votes allowed John Tester to escape have a narrow win in 2012. That's not here this time. Bullock is going to have to win a majority of the vote to win this race. And given the polling right now, the lean of the state where Trump is likely to win the state by double digits, there's just not a lot there at this point suggesting that Bullock has enough to pull it over. That doesn't mean he's going to lose by a large margin. By all accounts, he's a good candidate. But a lot of that early momentum he seemed to have has just kind of evaporated into a more typical race you would expect here. Marginally competitive, definitely good polling for Bullock, but unless we see some stuff changing, some dynamics in the race, a scandal, or some good polls for Bullock, there's not a whole lot here to suggest that, given the lean of the state, that this deserves to be in the same column as Iowa in particular, which does seem like the marquee toss-up race of the cycle.
Yes, I would agree with that at this point. I mean, there are still undecideds to take into account when you're looking at this, but even 2 of the last 3 polls that have been conducted had Daines at 50%, which is enough to win the election at the minimum. Yeah. So even without those undecided voters,
and
but
polls
it's still
were
going to be
fairly
a
accurate in
fascinating
2018.
race. Yeah, and it is going to be a fascinating race. I would still say Bullock is going to have a close race. I wouldn't say he's going to end up like some of the more conservative people on Twitter have said, like someone like Phil Bredesen, for example, because Bredesen had been out of office for 10 years when he was running for Senate versus Bullock, who's the incumbent governor. Has a bit more name recognition, and even though he said his approvals have gone down, he still has those approvals, and he's still in the public eye as an incumbent governor. Whereas if a governor leaves office, the people tend to forget about them pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Bullock is a good candidate. I think there's a reason that he was reluctant to take this race on to begin with, and ultimately there will be debates, there will be some stuff here, but fundamentally, it's not very common. Obviously, we saw this last cycle in Florida where a non-controversial incumbent is taken out by a member of the opposite party when the main party is winning the state. This happens sometimes, but the Bullock campaign just doesn't seem to have the early strength it had, specifically with leading every single poll. It felt like every week or every couple of weeks there was a new poll showing Bullock ahead. Some of them by 4, 5, 6 point margins. Now it's the opposite. A good poll for Bullock at this point is within one or 2. Emerson, I think, had it at 6 points. There was another poll that had it at 5. I mean, I would love to see more polling here, but in the absence of that, and just with the fundamentals of what's going on, I think leans is the reason that this choice was made. And granted, that doesn't mean Bullock can't win. Obviously, we saw a lot of states that election prognosticators had rated as leans, flip in 2016 and 2018. But this is just our group of things at the moment as we're thinning through this toss-up column.
Yep. And Jared, do you have anything you want to say about this race?
Yeah. Steve Bullock is a very credible challenger to Steve Daines, but Steve Daines is a pretty unassuming incumbent. He keeps his head down. He's more of a backbencher, and from what I understand and from what he conveys, at least through his advertisements, he delivers for the people of Montana, and his voting record has been consistent with someone who do you expect, a Republican from a more Western state that really emphasizes agriculture and the environment. But I think when you look at the other races as well, because there's going to be a gubernatorial race with Greg Gianforte. There's going to be a House race with Matt Rosendale, who's the orator, who who lost in 2018 in the Senate race there. But Republicans do have advantages in those two other races. And that combined with a presidential advantage, Trump is going to most likely there'd be quite an issue for Trump if Biden managed to win the state, because this should be a clean state for Trump to get. Now, he might have some reduced margins from back in 2016 because he had an overwhelming victory in 2016, and perhaps some of those places like Gallatin County and Helena, Bozeman are moving a little bit to the left, a little more favorably to Biden. But still, Trump is destined to win this state. And so with all those factors in mind, it's just a very tall order for Steve Bullock, despite his popularity, to clear a majority of the vote. And this also being a presidential year, you're going to have increased Republican turnout from, say, 2018.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at 2012, John Tester won with 48.6% of the vote. A Libertarian took up around 6 to 7% of the vote. That's also delivered him to his first term, and it certainly helped him most recently, although he did clear a majority barely this cycle. Again, the question here, it's not like in South Carolina where the Harrison camp, you mentioned it's difficult for you to get more than 46%. They're like, yeah, we can hit 46%. It's just the Constitution Party candidate and undervotes are going to take up, the 7 to 8% of the vote we need to win. That's not the case here. That's not a route that is available. You have to win a majority of the vote. And while Steve Bullock has won a majority of the vote in gubernatorial contests in state level years, that doesn't, in federal years, that doesn't mean he'll do it this time. Obviously, Montana is a tricky state to follow. It's had some idiosyncratic results. I do think it's kind of interesting. The House race seems to be the closest race of the cycle by far. Republicans seem pretty well suited to take back the governor's mansion. We have that it leans Republican. Not a sure thing, but it seems favored. But that House race it seems to be the one that's sneaking up a little bit. That I would almost say is a better shot at this point for Democrats than the Senate race. At least that's just what I'm looking at with the polling, overall. It seems like that one is really gone under the radar. And in the event of a split electoral college, as difficult of a concept as that is to happen at this point, Montana's vote does count as one delegation, which is crucial to breaking the deadlock and deciding who the next president would be in that case. Places like Alaska, for that matter, the House race there, will have a major impact if that happens.
Yeah, and another comment on that is that one of the issues that's befallen the Montana Republican Party's chances at securing seats, like back in 2018 when they lost against John Tester, is the fact that for such a red state, their bench is very limited. And to have a state auditor, for example, running for a seat so crucial and so high, in the order of things in the United States as a U.S. Senate seat, for such a Republican state, there really should be more of a bolstered advantage for Republicans. They really should have more people there. But just because of Montana's unique nature, this is not the case. Fortunately for Steve Daines, he is the bench of the Montana Republican Party. I mean, he is the most, in terms of his standing in the U.S. government, he is the most senior member because the other senator is a Democrat, the governor is a Democrat, and so he is the bench. And so I think that in itself is to have such a red state behind you, one that votes so consistently Republican on the presidential level, it's going to help him. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, Republicans do control, for the first time in a long time, a majority of the statewide offices. That's something they didn't have until recently. As recently as 2012 and 2016, Democrats had almost every single office except for Tim Fox's seat, the Attorney General, who was trying to run for governor against Greg Gianforte. So, yeah, 2012. So I mean, Republicans
he ran again as well.
Yeah, he lost in the primary, but again, that's the sort of bench you want to build up where you can have a candidate lose like that in a race. He was literally their only statewide officer up until that cycle. So I mean, up until 2016, where Republicans started to take more of these seats. So again, this is kind of a long-term shift. Montana's always been a quirky state in that it's tended to vote Republican, but it likes having Democratic senators, likes having Democratic governors, to an extent, like having a split legislature, Democratic statewide officers. In some ways, I mean, Steve Daines is only, I believe, the third Republican senator since 1912.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like literally the only other one was Conrad Burns, and I believe one other senator. And obviously Conrad Burns was defeated in 2006. So it's a tricky state. It's one that Republicans should have a long-term optimism for, but it would be big for them, I think, to win an election in a presidential year like this for the first time in a while, because really that's not been the case of winning these. 2000, Conrad Burns narrowly defeated the future governor Brian Schweiker. That's kind of the last really positive presidential year result Montana Republicans have had. If you just look at it, all their victories, like for example, Daines's win came in 2014, an off year. It's just been a problematic state for Republicans for quite a while. I know a lot of Republicans who are frustrated with the voters, like the state doesn't make any sense politically, but this would be good long-term for Republicans in Montana if they can pull this off. And it seems like at the moment they're favored to. Whether or not they get a clean sweep of everything remains to be seen. I would say that the House race is the closest of these so far, at least from what I'm looking at.
Yeah,
and then the governor and then the Senate race.
I wouldn't say I 100% believe that, but I would respect that opinion. So I think now we should move on to talk a little bit about the presidential debate for a little bit. It's tomorrow in Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. It's going to be moderated by Chris Wallace. And, it'll be interesting. So what do you guys expect the debate to be focused on issue-wise between Trump and Biden?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just throw it to either of you.
Yeah, I can start for this one. So I think, as expected, one of the prevailing topics is going to be the COVID-19 response. Democrats, part of their messaging, part of their strategy has been that Trump has failed in his response, that he's hidden valuable information from the American people, that he's not listened to the experts at the CDC and Fauci, and that he has pretty much been an embarrassment in this regard as compared to other developed nations in the world, which have been more proactive. Now, I'm not saying that that's my opinion. I'm saying that that's going to be the Democratic messaging on that front. And Joe Biden's really going to have to be very skilled with that, be very tactical if he wants to resonate with voters who do care about that topic more so than others. But now you have in the mix, of course, the vacant Supreme Court seat. And this is not something that any of us expected 2 weeks ago, of course, because this is a very recent development. But it's going to be on the top of voters' minds along with the COVID crisis and response. And there's been a lot of debate nationally about whether Republicans actually defied precedent, whether, not really speaking legally, but just traditionally, in the sense that Mitch McConnell and other Republicans did not want to advance Merrick Garland back in 2016 through the process, whereas now, of course, Amy Coney Barrett is being advanced through the process, and they're trying to expedite that to the fullest extent. And so there is going to be some conversation about whether that is hypocritical. To be fair and to try to be bipartisan in this sense, Republicans are going to try to convey that the stakes and that the goalposts are not the same as they were in 2016. Lindsey Graham in particular, even though, of course, he's not going to be in this race, I think he could potentially loom heavily over this topic, in the sense that he really epitomized the fact that Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation in 2018 really did change the stakes. It moved the goalposts. And that's going to be the messaging on the Republican front. Again, saying that, we understand what we said back in 2016, but things are different now. We used to confirm justices in a very bipartisan manner. Back when Sotomayor and Kagan were confirmed, they had crossover support from Republicans. Now things are different. The stakes are way higher. Things are much more polarized. And we cannot confront this the same way that we did back in 2016. So to put it all in summation, that's going to be, I think, Donald Trump's best strategy to try to appeal to voters. And really what Trump should be doing is trying to coalesce and reconsolidate those voters who have moved away from him but are traditionally Republican, and to have a Supreme Court nominee who is very qualified, who stands on the issues that are of an originalist or of a textualist perspective. Those could be things that are even more important to crucial voters than necessarily the language or the vitriol that's spewed from the White House. And so I think those are all going to be issues that are in some capacity touched on in the debate.
Mm-hmm. I think there's definitely an opportunity for Trump here, or plenty of opportunities. These debate topics on the surface mostly seem favorable. Obviously, COVID is a problem area, but if you look at some of these other ones, for example, the records. Trump is going to tout his economic record before the recession, which was admittedly pretty good. Supreme Court, that's an area for him to emphasize. Amy Coney Barrett, who by all means seems to be a fairly qualified candidate who, in normal circumstances, would probably be confirmed. I think he's hoping that Biden falls into the pitfall that some other media outlets are falling into, where they're not attacking her record. They're going after things that don't really matter, or they're kind of confused as to the nature of things. For example, there's just an Associated Press article that used it as an attack that she's part of a Catholic group that believes men are the head of the household. That's a belief a lot of people wouldn't agree with, but it's also a belief that probably the majority of Christians, or at least the ones who would be inclined to vote Republican, would agree with. That's something that they would see as an unfair attack on a religion. That's an area where he could take advantage of. The area on race and crime, that's one again where he could, if he's able to thread the needle there, he could gain. The question is if these topics, if he can actually do it. And he's basically placed the bar so low for Joe Biden, where I've kind of said this before, just stringing together a coherent sentence would really undermine a lot of what has been said. Mm-hmm. But it really has been set, I think, way too low. Whether or not the public has been paying attention to this bar being set and considers that, or they watch the debate in and of itself and judge on the performance, remains to be seen. But I think there's definitely opportunities for both sides. Biden has room to talk on these issues as well. He's seen consistently in polling as being the superior candidate on race relations. If the polling looks all right for him, the Supreme Court doesn't seem to necessarily be the huge winning issue Republicans thought it would be. It certainly seems to be favorable in some regards. I think there was a poll just the other day that indicated the majority of people think that Barrett should be confirmed if she is qualified. But it's also saying a lot of people think it should be done after the election, regarded by who wins. So that's not a conclusive position that voters are taking. Certainly not what Trump would have wanted. And I think election integrity is an area where Biden does have a lot of room to go on. There is a lot of fear being put out by multiple sides, I'll say, over the election stability and the integrity of the election. There is room for Biden to go here. But I do think with these topics, out of the three debates, this is probably the one opportunity that Trump has to really establish the tone, which he was good at doing last time. Who knows? Maybe he'll come up with a stunt like he did last cycle that really overshadows a mediocre debate performance. But with his polls not being where he wants them to be, with seemingly being an assault in every single conceivably swingy state, just Democratic ad drops in Ohio at this point of the cycle should be concerning for Donald Trump. This will be very consequential, I think. The question is if these debates do matter as much as they used to. But I do think this is an opportunity, a rare opportunity for both of these candidates to establish themselves when in a non-traditional campaign where they've not had the opportunity to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And do you have any closing thoughts on this, Jared?
Yeah. So I'll make this sort of my closing statement, if you will. Donald Trump is going to try to label Joe Biden as a candidate who's going to spur a lot of racial resentment and exacerbate the current situation. He's going to try to label Joe Biden as a progressive, one who aligns himself with some of the more leftist members of the House. He's going to try to say that Joe Biden is not going to have a coalition that really tries to deliver safety to the American people. And so sort of in line with Richard Nixon's stance back in 1968, sort of a law and order tone is going to be imposed by Trump. On the other hand, Joe Biden is if he actually makes an effective debate strategy, he's going to label himself as a status quo candidate. He's going to say this stuff is happening within Trump's America, and Trump is not taking the necessary steps to confront it and quell these concerns and quell these riots. And so Joe Biden will have a lot of ammunition on the front too, and a lot of voters who are swinging more towards Biden do see him as the status quo candidate. The status quo ante, of course, being that Joe Biden wants to return America to a state of safety and normalcy that was experienced before all these things swept over the nation. And so each candidate's going to try to paint the other in a pretty false and negative light. And so it's going to really be how these candidates respond to these distinct attacks. And that's going to define their performance in these debates, I think.
Yeah, and when you look at the debate in general, if we look at the standards that were set in the 2016 debate, we can expect our fair share of unprofessionalism between the candidates. I don't think it's going to be completely professional in the sense that past presidential debates have been. I just think it's too hard for both candidates to refrain from attacking each other because they're both going to be questioning each other's credibility. They're both going to be questioning each other's records, and they're both going to try and misrepresent the views of their respective political parties to the voters in an effort to benefit their own respective narratives, as you guys have mentioned. And when that happens to either candidate, we're going to see a response elicited from the candidates, and it'll probably be a somewhat agitated response.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think if there's any moderator that can hold things together, it's Chris Wallace. He's generally seen as a very fair and impartial reporter, and I think he was a phenomenal choice to moderate this first debate. So I think if there's going to be one that could be more civil, this would be kind of a one, because he would be someone that strikes me as a strong moderator who probably would not tolerate some of the more excesses you see in a lot of debates. Another factor is there's not going to be a crowd to feed off of. Normally presidential debates, there is an audience, and while they're not allowed to applaud
it's during critical media here, actually.
Yeah, they're not allowed to applaud during debate. They do applaud at the end. They can have impromptu moments where you can appeal to them, whereas Trump is going to be appealing to a virtual crowd. There's many things that Trump is good at, but I'm not sure appealing to someone virtually is his strong suit. That's a different game.
Yeah, and Trump's polemics are going to be heavily stunted just because there is that reception from a boisterous audience that he'd usually get in normal circumstances. But Joe Biden, I think, if he takes a more pragmatic and matter-of-fact approach, it's really going to benefit him in the long run.
And Joe Biden just has to effectively hold himself together. And if he can do that, it can kind of debunk some of Trump's criticism. He's incompetent and cannot debate properly.
Yeah, I think his number one thing is going to be appearing competent, which Joe Biden's not an all-star debater. He arguably fluked, two pretty the debate with Sarah Palin and the debate with Paul Ryan, neither of which he came off as particularly strong. Granted, neither of the other candidates did, but you would expect someone like a Sarah Palin to be demolished by Biden. That simply did not happen. So there is the potential for what has typically been a fairly mediocre performance to happen again. But I think he's been preparing for this a lot. You're seeing a lid called on a lot of his activities early in the day. I think he is engaging heavily in preparing for this debate and making sure he puts his best foot forward. Because for a lot of people, this may be the first moment they're watching the campaign seriously.
And
a lot of people
Trump has also been questionable about his debate prep. I think Trump may be in for a rude awakening if he just expects Biden to basically be incompetent.
Yeah,
particularly the drug test stunt really didn't make a whole lot of sense. His previous stunts in the debates at least followed. You had the Access Hollywood tape, and then you had him bringing out Bill Clinton's accusers. Was it a dirty stunt? Sure, but did it make sense? At least as something that would make sense from a political perspective. Yeah, I'm not sure what this stunt of is Joe Biden on medication really does for anything. It's not eye-popping. It's not ear-catching. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I don't think he would want to dwell on that too much in the debate. Just in total.
Because that opens up the door to even more ad hominem attacks that could be directed towards Trump. And Trump definitely has a lot to go or a lot to be received on that front. And so Trump might not even want to address anything like that, because again, it could cause the debate to devolve into something that none of us even anticipated.
One thing I do think that will not show up is any allegations of sexual assault. I think that's a mutually assured destruction of both candidates. Obviously, Trump has a more extensive accusation history in terms of that, but Joe Biden did have his. I think it's in the best interest of both candidates not to mention it and just to ignore it as an issue, because I don't think anything positive would come from that discussion.
And I think both candidates are going to be pressured, especially by the moderation, to focus on the issues at hand. And there will be tangents, but will they dominate the debate? Not entirely sure at the moment. I mean, we're going to have to wait and see. But I think that pretty much wraps up our episode. And we're looking at we looked at the race ratings and we looked at the presidential debate. So do you guys have anything else you want to add?
No, I believe we're going to be doing at some point tomorrow a debate party or a debate watch or something of some sort, either on the account or on some sort of stream. So stay tuned for our plans in that regard. I think we're still looking at the details. I know there's several of us here that want to do something to kind of have a little bit of fun there. So we'll keep you updated if anything comes through on that front.
Yep. Thank you guys for coming on tonight.
Yep. Thank you.